other soldier, hey, I don't like to kill, but sometimes it can't be avoided.
This is David Lewis Rice, a pitiful, cowardly failure who would go down in history as one of the most notorious mass murderers in the United States. He didn't just kill an entire family over a lie that was more than 30 years old. He still believes he did the right thing, even though his victims had done nothing wrong. By the end of this video, you can decide for yourself. Did they get the justice they deserved, or was his punishment too soft? Before we uncover how paranoid delusions and extremist propaganda led to the systematic execution of an innocent family, please consider subscribing. These stories need to be told, and the victims deserve to be remembered for who they really were, not what their killer imagined them to be. Charles Goldmark was the kind of lawyer other attorneys studied. He was a Yale Law graduate and was a former Army intelligence officer. By 1985, at age 41, he'd co-founded his own firm and become a key player in Washington state Democratic politics. He'd served as legal counsel to the party and played a crucial role in Gary Hart's 1984 presidential campaign. Colleagues described him as brilliant but approachable, the type who remembered everyone's names at the courthouse. His wife Annie, 37, balanced her career as a teacher with raising their two sons, Derek and Colin. Friends recalled her as the organizational force behind the family, coordinating school events, hosting dinner parties, making sure Charles ate lunch between his back-to-back cases. Derek, 12 years old, was the athlete of the family. Basketball, soccer, baseball, if it involved a ball, Derek was interested. At that time, he'd recently started teaching his younger brother Colin how to shoot free throws in their driveway. Colin, just 10, was the family artist. While Derek collected sports trophies, Colin filled sketchbooks. His fourth-grade teacher kept one of his drawings, a detailed portrait of the family dog, on her classroom wall. From what you can hear, the Goldmark family seemed like everything you'd imagine: loving, close-knit, and well-off, with family always coming first. Additionally, the Goldmarks lived at 3614 East Republican Street in Madrona, one of those Seattle neighborhoods where century-old trees line the streets and you could walk to Lake Washington in 10 minutes. Their house wasn't the largest on the block, but it had character: a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors and a kitchen Annie had personally redesigned. The front door bore a Christmas wreath that Annie and the boys had made together the first week of December. And on that Christmas Eve, they were expecting dinner guests at 7:30 p.m. Annie had spent the morning preparing. Charles had actually taken the afternoon off, a rarity for him, to help set the table with their good china. Derek and Colin were upstairs, having been promised they could stay up late since it was Christmas Eve. Everything was exactly as it should be in a house preparing to celebrate. But just like any family, the Goldmarks also had their share of worries. They carried a burden they never wanted, a political controversy from many years earlier. It had nothing to do with Charles or Annie, yet it would one day lead to their tragic end. And to understand how that played a role, we need to go way back to 1962, more than 20 years before the murders. Charles was a young freshman at Reed College in Portland, while his father, John Goldmark, was running for another term as a Washington state representative. John had already served 3 strong terms for Okanogan County and was known as a dedicated leader who fought hard to improve education in rural communities. Then Ashley Holden entered the picture. The editor of the Tonasket Tribune launched a vicious campaign against John Goldmark, publishing article after article claiming he was part of a monstrous conspiracy to remake America into a totalitarian state. And Holden's evidence was that John's wife, Sally, had briefly joined the Communist Party during the Great Depression, when she was 23 years old, unemployed, and desperate. She'd attended a handful of meetings in 1935, realized it wasn't for her, and left the party before ever meeting John. But Holden didn't care about the truth. He focused on Sally's short membership from 30 years earlier and twisted it into a story that the whole Goldmark family were secret communists. He even used the fact that Charles went to Reed College, which had recently invited a controversial speaker, as proof of his claims. Soon, the rumors spread fast. Local American Legion groups repeated the story. Anonymous flyers showed up on car windshields. Even the John Birch Society joined in. And in the end, the lies won. John Goldmark lost the primary, and his political career was destroyed by a smear campaign built on nothing but fear and false accusations. But the Goldmarks fought back. They hired attorney William Dwyer and sued Holden for libel. The trial became a sensation. Hollywood figures who'd faced similar accusations during the McCarthy era testified in support of the Goldmarks. Charles, then still in college, took the stand to defend his school's reputation. After weeks of testimony, the jury sided with the Goldmarks, awarding them $40,000 in damages, roughly $400,000 in today's money. The court had officially declared the communist accusations false. John Goldmark was vindicated, but court victories don't erase whispers. The story lived on in far-right newsletters and extremist meetings. It mutated with each retelling, details getting fuzzier, facts getting twisted, until the story barely resembled reality. By 1985, John and Sally Goldmark had both been dead for years. John since 1979, Sally since 1975. They never lived to see their son Charles build his successful legal career or meet their grandchildren. But their names lived on in the paranoid fantasies of extremist groups, particularly one called the Duck Club. And this is where David Lewis Rice entered the picture. David was 27 years old in December 1985, though people who met him often thought he was younger. 5'8", thin build, with unkempt brown hair and a habit of avoiding eye contact. He'd been living in Seattle for 3 years, drifting between homeless shelters and sleeping in his beat-up Chevrolet until he met Ann Davis. David's life had been a series of failures punctuated by violence. Born in Durango, Colorado in 1958, he'd grown up watching his alcoholic father beat his mother. By 15, his parents had separated, leaving David to essentially raise himself. He dropped out of high school in 10th grade, unable to concentrate on academics while his home life crumbled. At 17, David joined the Navy, seeing it as his escape route. He lasted exactly 4 weeks in boot camp before being discharged for inability to adapt to military life. And that rejection stung. His fellow recruits had mocked him for his paranoid beliefs about communist infiltration in the government, ideas he'd picked up from his father's drunken rants. Now, David married at 20, had a son, but his wife left him after 18 months. Court records show she cited irrational jealousy and controlling behavior. He'd accuse her of being a communist sympathizer if she watched certain news channels. He'd fly into rages over imagined slights. The divorce was finalized in 1981, with his ex-wife receiving full custody and David getting supervised visitation he never used. By 1982, David had drifted to Seattle, working sporadically as a welder when he could find jobs. Most employers let him go within weeks because he'd argue with supervisors, accuse co-workers of spying on him, disappear for days without explanation. He was living in the Chevrolet when he met Ann Davis at a food bank in late 1983. At that time, Ann was 40 years old, a naturopath who ran a small practice out of her Capitol Hill apartment. She saw something in David that others missed, or maybe she was just lonely. Within weeks, David would move into her apartment. Ann would then introduce him to her social circle, which included members of the Duck Club. Now, we can't really move forward without breaking down what this group actually was, so let me give you a quick but important look at the Duck Club. The Duck Club held weekly meetings in a plain, forgettable building near Boeing Field. It was founded by Homer Brand, a former Boeing worker who had been fired for handing out anti-Semitic flyers at his job. From there, he built a group of around 20 to 30 people who all believed the same thing. that America was secretly being taken over by a so-called Jewish communist plot. Their meetings always followed the same pattern. Brand would start by reading from far-right newsletters. Members would then share their own tips about people they suspected were communists, such as neighbors, co-workers, even strangers. Sometimes they invited guest speakers who warned about imaginary invasions or hidden enemies. One speaker they admired the most was Colonel Gordon Jack Moore, a traveling conspiracy figure who claimed he had secret knowledge about communists working inside the government. In fact, here's an excerpt from one of Moore's speeches that we were able to obtain.
In 1977, the Gulf of Baja California, December the 3rd, 1976, excuse me, there was a 27-ship convoy of Russian ships came around the point of the Baja and landed in these two areas here. These ships came in at nighttime. By the next morning, they had been unloaded. They had been loaded onto flat cars that were waiting in this area here at this point, and this point. And from there, they were camouflaged, and they were sent up. Look where they went. Right up here to the border, from here to the border, another branch to the border here, up to the border at El Paso.
David attended his very first Duck Club meeting in January 1985. He sat quietly in the back, hanging on to every word like it was absolute truth. When Moore's writings were passed around the room, David grabbed extra copies. He even started a notebook where he copied long sections from these pamphlets, detailed notes on how to identify and remove supposed communist threats. Then came the October 1985 meeting. This was the moment everything took a sharp and dangerous turn. During the meeting, Homer Brand brought up the Goldmark family. He had been digging through old John Birch Society material from the 1962 election, and he mentioned Ann Goldmark's old connection to the Communist Party from decades earlier. But Brand was sloppy. He mixed up Ann with other members of the family, got dates wrong, and insisted the Goldmarks were still part of communist groups. None of this was true, but David wrote down every single word like it was fact. After that meeting, he went straight to the Seattle Public Library to research the Goldmarks. The only records he found were from John Goldmark's 1963 libel trial, which clearly proved the accusations had been false. But David either misunderstood it or didn't want to understand it. In his mind, just the fact that a trial existed somehow meant there must be guilt. From there, everything escalated. On November 15th, he began watching the Goldmarks in secret. He parked near Charles's law office and followed him home. He even studied the family's routines and wrote all of it down in his notebook, right next to Moore's frightening instructions about neutralizing communist cells. David also experimented on himself. In early December, he tested chloroform, timing how long it knocked him unconscious. He practiced with toy handcuffs to see how fast he could restrain someone. Every step pushed him deeper into a world of fear and fantasies that no one else around him shared. By December 20th, he had already chosen the day, Christmas Eve. In his mind, it was perfect. The streets would be quiet, people would be home, the police would be busy, and most importantly, the Goldmark family would all be together. And that was exactly what he wanted.
A lot of people are going to say I'm psycho or something like that, but there really is a definite plan to turn this world into a one-world communist government. It's proven and it's evident. All you have to do is look around.
Who are the ones that try and take over? What other kinds of things have you seen that led you to this?
You can, like I said, you can just look around. The thing that really got to me and brought me into this was the fact that I had trained for a welding job, and I trained very hard for about a year, and I got one job out of that, and I was doing okay until the shop shut down. And I went on for just over a year before I finally came to the conclusion that something is definitely wrong. you know, something is wrong. This country does not get in this kind of shape without somebody actually putting it in that shape. And if you look around, all you have to do is open your eyes and see that, yeah, it's being done purposefully.
At around 6:45 in the evening on December 24th, David parked his Chevrolet a few blocks away from the Goldmark home. He dressed in dark clothes and carried a white box made to look like a holiday package. Inside the box were a realistic-looking toy gun, 2 pairs of handcuffs, and a bottle of chloroform. The Goldmark house glowed warmly from the outside. Their Christmas tree shimmered through the front window, and soft classical music played inside. At exactly 7 o'clock, David walked up the steps and rang the doorbell. Their 10-year-old son, Colin, opened the door. His expression changed from curious to cautious as he saw a stranger asking for his father. Colin called out for Charles while keeping the door partly open. Charles appeared with a dish towel in his hand, still helping Anne prepare dinner. David acted immediately. He took out the toy gun and forced his way inside. He ordered the family upstairs, where Anne had just finished showering. She stood in her bathrobe, trying to keep the boys close. David made all 4 of them lie face down on the carpet and handcuffed Charles and Anne. Charles tried to stay calm. He offered his wallet, the small amount of cash inside, and even mentioned an ATM card, hoping to divert the situation. He gave David a PIN, but it was a fake, something David would only learn later. When Charles mentioned that their dinner guests were expected to arrive at 7:30, David realized his plan was running out of time. He soaked a cloth with chloroform and pressed it against each family member until they fell unconscious. Derek resisted the most, twisting away, but David managed to overpower him. Soon, all 4 were unconscious on the bedroom floor. David hurried downstairs to find something he could use as a weapon. He grabbed a heavy steam iron from the laundry room and one of Anne's kitchen knives, a large blade she had used earlier for cooking. When he returned upstairs, the chloroform was wearing off faster than he expected. Charles was already beginning to move. David attacked with the iron, striking Charles first, then Anne, then the boys. Blood spread across the walls, the bedding, and his clothes. But even after the blows, all 4 family members were still alive. He switched to the knife. Charles suffered several stab wounds to the head. Derek received 3, and Colin 5. Anne, whose skull had not broken from the blows, was stabbed twice in the chest. By 7:28, David heard a car pulling up outside, the family's dinner guests arriving earlier than expected. Panicking, he grabbed what he could: Charles's wallet, some of Anne's jewelry, and papers from Charles's briefcase that he wrongly believed contained communist information. Then he slipped out through the back door and fled. As you can tell, the visitors who arrived were the first to discover the carnage, and those visitors were Mirko and Gertrude Vidovich. They had known the Goldmarks for 5 years and arrived at exactly 7:30 in the evening, carrying bottles of wine and expecting a warm, cheerful holiday gathering. Instead, they found darkness. The porch light was off, and no one answered the doorbell. Through the front window, they could see the Christmas tree lights flickering, but there was no movement inside. They waited for 5 minutes and knocked again, still getting no response. Gertrude suggested the Goldmarks might have stepped out for last-minute errands. They returned to their car and waited, growing uneasy. By 8 o'clock, Mirko decided to check the back door. It was locked. The garage door was down, but through a window he could see both cars still inside. By 8:15, they knocked on a neighbor's door. Bob Campbell hadn't noticed anything unusual, but agreed something felt off. He called the Goldmark house. No answer. He tried again, and this time the phone rang inside, but still no one picked up. At 10:30, Campbell called 911, explaining that the Goldmarks were unreachable after the dinner guests arrived. While speaking to the dispatcher, he pressed his ear against the front door and heard it, a low, gurgling moan coming from somewhere inside. Officers James Pomeroy and Scott Tompkins arrived at 10:48. The front door was locked, but a partially open window offered access. Pomeroy boosted Tompkins inside. The officer's flashlight revealed a living room frozen in time, presents untouched beneath the Christmas tree, decorations still sparkling, and the kitchen showing evidence of interrupted preparations, vegetables half chopped, the oven still warm. Tompkins climbed the stairs, calling out the standard warning. The moaning grew louder, coming from the master bedroom. He pushed the door open and froze. His radio crackled urgently. A code 3, multiple victims, send everything. Inside, Charles Goldmark was barely alive. His skull had multiple fractures, with brain tissue exposed through some of the wounds. He could not speak but struggled weakly against his handcuffed arms. Beside him lay Annie, motionless, her chest wounds having proved fatal within minutes of the attack. The boys were huddled in a corner. 10-year-old Colin had died almost instantly from his injuries. 12-year-old Derek, who had fought the hardest, was still breathing, but only shallow, ragged breaths. Paramedics worked frantically on the bedroom floor, starting IVs and attempting to stabilize both Charles and Derek for transport to the hospital. Detective Bob Keppel arrived at 12:15 a.m. on Christmas morning. A veteran investigator who'd worked the Ted Bundy case, Keppel immediately recognized this wasn't a typical home invasion. The chloroform, the handcuffs, the specific targeting of the family. This was planned. Personal. The crime scene told a story of preparation meeting panic. The killer had brought restraints but had to find weapons in the house. He'd disabled the downstairs phone but left the upstairs extension working. He'd taken small valuables but left expensive electronics. This wasn't about robbery. On December 26th, David Rice walked into the Admiral Benbow Inn in Seattle's University District. He'd been drinking since Christmas morning, trying to drown the images he couldn't forget. The bartender, Tony Gibbons, noticed David seemed agitated and kept talking about completing a mission and eliminating the top communist. Interestingly, David had left a confession note in his apartment and told Homer Brand from the Duck Club that he'd dumped the top communist. Brand, horrified, called his lawyer, who called the FBI. By 5 p.m. on December 26th, David was in custody.
I'm not an evil person. I fight basically to keep people alive rather than just to kill.
You sure did something that's pretty evil.
That's right, I did.
And it doesn't seem to me that you have much remorse about it.
I don't feel much of anything. When I can feel something, then I imagine you'll see remorse.
The confession David gave was deeply chilling, revealing a mind consumed by delusion. He truly believed that Charles Goldmark was the leader of a communist cell plotting an invasion. In his twisted plan, he intended to force Charles to reveal the names of other members and then eliminate the entire network. The children, he said, were simply unfortunate casualties because they had seen his face. David showed no remorse for the deaths of Colin and Annie. Instead, he expressed anger that Charles and Derek had survived the initial attack. Charles would succumb to his injuries on December 28th, never regaining enough consciousness to speak. Derek clung to life until January 9th, 1986, spending his final weeks in a coma as machines struggled to keep his severely damaged body functioning. David's trial began on May 12, 1986. His defense team pursued an insanity plea, bringing in Dr. Kenneth Muscatel, who diagnosed David with schizoid personality disorder complicated by paranoid delusions. Muscatel testified that while David was mentally ill, he understood his actions were wrong. He'd tried to hide evidence, fled the scene, and initially lied to police. Prosecutor William Downing presented a different narrative, that David was an angry, failed man who found purpose in extremist ideology. His beliefs might have been irrational, but his actions were calculated. He'd studied the family for weeks, tested his chloroform method, and timed the attack for maximum vulnerability. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On June 16, 1986, they found David Rice guilty on 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Judge Francis Holman sentenced Rice to death, calling the crimes an act of savage brutality against innocent people based on twisted political fantasies. But the story doesn't end there. In 1997, David's sentence was commuted to life without parole when Washington State temporarily invalidated capital punishment. He remains at the Monroe Correctional Complex, where he's reported to still believe the Goldmarks were communists. Homer Brand and the Duck Club disbanded within months of the murders, several members expressing horror that their rhetoric had inspired such violence. Colonel Jack Moore continued speaking at extremist events until his death in 2003, never acknowledging his writing's role in the murders. The Goldmark house was eventually sold, renovated, the bedroom where the family died transformed into something unrecognizable. Sadly, the tragedy of the Goldmark family was not an isolated case. Other families have also suffered unimaginable loss during the Christmas season, including the Yazdanpanah family, whose lives were taken in another devastating act of violence.
911, where is your emergency? Hello, Grapevine 911. You need help? Are you sick? What was that?
That whispered confession you just heard came from a man dressed as Santa Claus on Christmas morning of 2011. But here's what makes this case even more chilling. The caller wasn't reporting a crime. He was confessing to one. And by the time police arrived at that apartment in Grapevine, Texas, 7 people were dead, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and half-opened presents. What happened in those final 5 minutes would reveal a level of betrayal so calculated that investigators are still haunted by one detail. The killer tried to frame his own victim before taking his life, leaving behind a crime scene that would challenge everything we thought we knew about family annihilators. For starters, Grapevine, Texas sits just northwest of Dallas, the kind of place where neighbors actually know each other's names and kids still ride bikes until the streetlights come on. With a population hovering around 50,000, it's big enough to have everything you need but small enough that news travels fast. And in the tight-knit neighborhood where the Yazdanpanah family lived, people looked out for each other. Nazrin Yazdanpanah was 55 years old, and if you'd met her at one of the local spas where she worked, you'd remember her warmth. She had this way of making everyone feel welcome, even when her own life was falling apart behind closed doors. Born in Iran, she'd built a life in America with her husband Aziz, raising their daughter Nona and son Ali in what seemed like the American dream. Nona was 19, fresh out of high school and starting community college. Friends described her as quiet but thoughtful, the kind of person who remembered your birthday even if you'd only mentioned it once. She loved photography and had this habit of taking candid shots of her family when they weren't looking, capturing moments that now feel unbearably precious. She'd told friends she wanted to become a teacher, maybe work with kids who struggled the way she had struggled, though she never quite explained what she meant by that. Ali was 15, the baby of the family, though he would have hated being called that. He was at that age where everything feels possible and impossible at the same time. Into video games, starting to notice cars, counting down the days until he could get his driver's permit. His teachers said he was bright but distracted lately, like something was weighing on him. But here's the thing about the Yazdanpanah family, and this is where the story starts to crack at the edges. They weren't actually living together anymore. Not for months. You see, Aziz Yazdanpanah had once been successful. Really successful. As a real estate agent in the booming Texas market, he'd provided well for his family. They had the big house, the nice cars, the whole package. He was 56 years old, had been in America for decades, and seemed to have achieved everything an immigrant could hope for. But then something shifted. And when I tell you this man's fall from grace was spectacular, I mean it changed everything about who he was. It started with what seemed like a small mistake, a fraudulent tax filing. Maybe he thought he was being clever, maybe he was desperate, but the IRS doesn't play around. He was caught, convicted, and suddenly owed $30,000 in back taxes plus a $1,000 fine. For a family living paycheck to paycheck after losing his real estate license, it might as well have been $1 million. Now, here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean disturbing. When Nasreen suggested getting a job to help with the bills, Aziz exploded, not just upset, not just disappointed, but genuinely enraged that his wife would even suggest such a thing. In his mind, he was the man, the provider, the head of the household. Her getting a job meant he had failed. And Aziz Yazdanpanah did not handle failure well. But Nasreen did it anyway. She got not one but 2 jobs at local spas, working long hours to keep food on the table while Aziz sat at home, unemployed for over a decade, stewing in his own resentment. Neighbors would later say they'd see him puttering around the garden, but never leaving the house, never looking for work, just existing in his own bitter bubble. The tension in that house must have been unbearable. Nona started letting things slip to her friends, little comments about her dad that made them exchange worried glances. When they'd push for details, she'd backtrack, always ending with, "It's fine, really, it's fine." That phrase that kids use when everything is definitely not fine, but they don't know how to ask for help. By early 2011, Nasreen had had enough. After years of walking on eggshells, of working 2 jobs while her husband contributed nothing but anger and criticism, she spoke the words Aziz never thought he'd hear. "I want a divorce." She took Nona and Allie and moved into a smaller apartment about 2 miles away. Still in Grapevine, close enough that the kids could stay in their schools, but far enough that they could finally breathe. For the first time in years, there was laughter in their home. No more tension thick enough to cut with a knife. No more pretending everything was okay when Dad was in one of his moods. But if Nasreen thought distance would solve their problems, she was wrong. Dead wrong. Aziz couldn't let go. This man who had spent a decade doing nothing suddenly had all the energy in the world to make his estranged family's life difficult. He'd show up uninvited, call constantly, use the kids as pawns in his emotional warfare. Nona told friends things were getting harder and harder, though she wouldn't elaborate on what that meant. And then came Christmas Eve, 2011. At that time, Nasreen decided to throw a party. After the year they'd had, the divorce, the move, the constant stress, she wanted to give her kids something normal, something happy. So she invited everyone. And I mean everyone. Aunts, uncles, cousins, extended family members who hadn't seen each other in months. The apartment was packed with people, with laughter, with the smell of Persian food mixing with Christmas cookies. Everyone was invited. Everyone except Aziz. Now, we don't know exactly how he found out about the party. Maybe one of the kids mentioned it in passing. Maybe a well-meaning relative thought he should know. But however it happened, Aziz learned that his entire family was gathering for Christmas without him, and something inside him snapped. At approximately 10:45 on Christmas morning, Aziz Yazdanpanah showed up at Nasreen's apartment dressed in a full Santa Claus costume. Red suit, black boots, white beard, the whole act. He was carrying wrapped presents and had this big smile on his face, playing the role of the fun dad just trying to surprise his kids on Christmas. Nasreen answered the door, and you can imagine her shock. Here's her estranged husband, the man she'd finally escaped from, standing there dressed as Santa Claus. But it was Christmas morning. Her sister Zohre was there with her husband Hossein and their 22-year-old daughter, Sarah. The kids were there. How could she turn him away without ruining Christmas? So she let him in. Sarah immediately texted her boyfriend, and this detail is crucial because it gives us a timeline. At 10:50, she wrote, "Aziz arrived." The tone was clearly sarcastic, like, "Great, look who showed up." 15 minutes later, at 11:05, she sent another text. "Now he's trying to be Father of the Year." 5 minutes after that text at 11:10, someone in that apartment called 911.
Yet more revealing information, very hard to stomach this morning as we listen to Grapevine Police give us the latest update. They are now telling us that this gunman dressed as Santa Claus was definitely an invited guest, welcome at this Christmas celebration, that no one knew he had arrived with 2 handguns he intended to use, and when he did, police say, he caught his victims totally by surprise.
When police kicked down the door, because yes, they had to kick it down, it was locked from the inside, they found a scene that even seasoned officers struggled to process. 7 bodies in the living room, surrounded by Christmas decorations and torn wrapping paper. But here's where it gets strange, really strange. 2 guns were found at the scene, one in Aziz's hand, one in Hossein's hand. At first glance, it looked like a murder self-harm situation. But which one was the killer? The initial theory was maybe both men had gotten into some kind of confrontation that escalated horribly, but the evidence told a different story. And this is where the investigation gets fascinating in the worst possible way. The gun in Hossein's hand? It had been wiped clean. No fingerprints at all. Now think about that for a second. You can't fire a gun without leaving prints unless you're wearing gloves, and Hossein wasn't wearing gloves. Someone had wiped that gun down and placed it in his hand after he was already dead. Even more damning was what the medical examiner found during the autopsy. Hossein had been shot 9 times, more than anyone else in that room. The trajectory patterns showed he'd been moving when he was shot, turning, likely trying to shield his wife and daughter. 1 bullet entered his chest, another his shoulder, several in his back as he turned away. This wasn't an execution. This was a man fighting for his family's survival against someone determined to kill him. The gunshot residue patterns became the smoking gun, if you'll pardon the expression. When a firearm discharges, it releases a cloud of microscopic particles, lead, barium, antimony, that settle on everything nearby. The person pulling the trigger gets covered in it, especially on their hands and clothing. Aziz was absolutely covered in gunshot residue. His hands tested positive for high concentrations. His Santa suit was peppered with it. Even his fake beard had traces. The amount was consistent with someone who'd fired multiple rounds from close range. But Hossein? He had the same trace amounts as the women who were pure victims. The same amount you'd expect from simply being in a room where guns were fired, not from actually firing one. The forensic technician who analyzed the evidence said it was one of the clearest cases of staging she'd ever seen. Someone had killed Hossein, wiped down that 9mm pistol, and placed it in his dead hand to create the illusion of a gunfight. The 911 call became even more chilling when audio experts enhanced it. They used specialized software to isolate different sound frequencies, separating the voices like peeling apart layers of an onion. What they found made even seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. In the background, barely audible, was a woman's voice, likely Nazrin or Zori, pleading, "Help, help me." The desperation in those 3 words was haunting. But clearer, closer to the phone, was the caller himself. Aziz Yazdanpanah, still dressed in that Santa suit, surrounded by the bodies of his family, calmly whispered, "I'm shooting people." Think about that for a moment. He called 911 on himself. In the middle of committing one of the worst family massacres in Texas history, he took the time to dial emergency services and confess. Was it guilt? A moment of clarity about what he'd done? Or was it something darker? A final act of control, making sure he'd be remembered, that his crime wouldn't go unnoticed? The investigation into why this happened took detectives deep into Aziz's final months, and what they found was a man completely unraveling. His laptop, recovered from the house he'd been living in alone, showed a disturbing pattern. He'd been obsessively checking Nasrin's Facebook page, sometimes dozens of times a day. He'd created fake accounts to try to friend her relatives, desperate for any glimpse into the life she was building without him. His search history included things like wife leaving husband Texas law and custody rights fathers Texas, and increasingly dark searches about violence and revenge that investigators declined to detail publicly. His financial records painted a picture of complete destitution. The man who'd once been a successful real estate agent, who'd provided his family with a comfortable suburban life, had $17 in his checking account the day before the murders. His credit cards were maxed out. He'd been borrowing money from distant relatives, lying about why he needed it. The house where he'd been living alone was in foreclosure proceedings. He was about to lose everything, and in his mind, he'd already lost what mattered most: control over his family. Phone records showed he'd called Nasrin 143 times in the month before the murders. Most calls went unanswered. The few she did answer rarely lasted more than 30 seconds. He'd also been calling the children's schools, trying to get information about their schedules, their grades, anything that would make him feel connected to their lives. The school secretary remembered him as desperate and pushy, constantly trying to override Nasrin's instructions about pickup arrangements. But here's where the investigation revealed something truly disturbing about the planning that went into this massacre. Those 2 guns Aziz brought to the apartment, he'd purchased ammunition for both of them 3 days before Christmas. The receipt was found in his car, 2 boxes of 9mm rounds and 1 box of .40 caliber bullets. He'd gone to a sporting goods store 70 miles away, presumably so no one local would remember him buying ammunition right before the holidays. The Santa suit was purchased from a costume shop in Fort Worth on December 23rd. He paid cash, but security cameras caught him trying it on, making sure it fit properly. The store clerk remembered him because he'd seemed so particular about getting the right size, saying it needed to be perfect for the kids. Detectives also discovered he'd been to Nasrin's apartment complex at least 3 times in the week before Christmas, caught on security cameras driving slowly through the parking lot late at night. He knew exactly where she lived, which apartment was hers, where she parked her car. He'd been watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. What makes the timeline of that morning even more heartbreaking is what investigators learned from interviewing other family members who'd been at the Christmas Eve party. Aziz hadn't been invited, but he'd called Nasrin's elderly mother that night, wishing her a Merry Christmas, sounding perfectly normal. He'd asked about the party, pretending he didn't know it was happening, getting details about who was there, what they were eating, how late everyone stayed. Nasrin's mother, trying to be kind, had told him everything, never imagining she was giving him intelligence for what he was planning. Now, let's talk about those 5 minutes between Sarah's last text and the 911 call, because investigators spent months trying to reconstruct exactly what happened. Based on the bullet trajectories and blood spatter patterns, they believe Aziz entered the apartment acting completely normal, probably giving presents to the kids, making small talk. Witnesses from the apartment complex reported hearing what sounded like firecrackers around 11:08, likely the first shots. The forensic reconstruction suggested Aziz shot Hossein first, probably because he was the only other adult male who might have been able to physically stop him. Hossein had defensive wounds on his hands, suggesting he'd tried to grab the gun or shield himself. He'd been shot multiple times as he tried to protect his family, falling near the Christmas tree. Nasrin was found near the kitchen, shot twice in the head. The position of her body suggested she'd been trying to run toward the bedrooms, possibly to protect the children or get to a phone. Her sister Zohre was found crouched in a corner, her arms still positioned as if shielding someone, likely her daughter Sarah, who was found directly behind her mother's body. The children, 19-year-old Nona and 15-year-old Ali, were found near the couch where they'd apparently been opening presents. The wrapping paper was still in Ali's hands. Nona had been shot 3 times. Investigators believe she might have stood up, perhaps to confront her father or plead with him before being killed. Ali appeared to have been shot where he sat, likely frozen in shock at what was unfolding. 22-year-old Sarah, whose texts had provided that crucial timeline, was found with her phone still clutched in her hand. The last thing on the screen was an unfinished text to her boyfriend, just the letter H, as if she'd been trying to type "help" when the shooting started. After killing 6 people in a matter of minutes, Aziz then staged the scene with Hossein, wiping down that second gun and placing it in the dead man's hand. Investigators believe he spent at least 2 or 3 minutes on this staging, methodically cleaning the weapon, positioning Hossein's fingers around the grip. The fact that he took this time, with his family dead around him, with neighbors potentially hearing the shots, shows a level of cold calculation that's hard to fathom. But then something changed. Maybe it was seeing his children's bodies. Maybe it was the realization that his plan to frame Hossein would never work. How could he explain being the only survivor? Maybe it was simply that his rage had finally burned out, leaving only the horror of what he'd done. Whatever the reason, Aziz picked up the .40 caliber pistol, the one he hadn't wiped clean, the one covered in his fingerprints and DNA, placed it against his temple, and pulled the trigger. When first responders arrived, they found a scene that looked like a war zone. The living room was destroyed, not from a struggle, but from the sheer violence of what had occurred. Blood spatter reached the ceiling, bullet holes riddled the walls, and in the middle of it all was a man in a Santa suit, the white beard now stained red, still clutching the gun that had taken 6 innocent lives. The Grapevine Police Department had never handled anything like this. Within hours, the Texas Rangers were on scene, followed by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The case would eventually involve over 50 investigators, forensic specialists, and support staff. They interviewed more than 200 people, neighbors, co-workers, extended family, anyone who might have seen warning signs or could provide context for what had driven Aziz to commit such an unthinkable act. What emerged was a pattern that's disturbingly common in family annihilator cases. The perpetrator is almost always male, usually the father or estranged partner. They've experienced a significant loss of control, divorce, job loss, financial ruin. They view their family not as individuals, but as extensions of themselves, possessions that reflect their success or failure. When faced with the loss of that family, they choose to destroy them rather than let them exist without them. In their twisted logic, death is preferable to life apart. The aftermath of the Grapevine Massacre rippled far beyond that apartment complex. The tight-knit Iranian-American community in North Texas was devastated. Many had known both families, had attended their celebrations, had watched Nona and Ali grow up. They struggled to reconcile the Aziz they thought they knew with the monster who could do this. Some admitted, in hindsight, that they'd noticed his controlling behavior, his anger at Nasrin for working, his inability to accept the divorce. But nobody had imagined it would lead to this. The case prompted serious discussions about domestic violence warning signs and the danger period after separation. Statistics show that women are at highest risk of violence from an intimate partner in the first 3 months after leaving. Nasrin had been separated from Aziz for nearly a year, but the danger hadn't passed. The exclusion from the Christmas party, the final severing of his connection to the family, had been enough to trigger his violent plan. Today, that apartment complex in Grapevine has a small memorial garden where the building once stood. The apartment itself was demolished. No one could bear to live there after what had happened. Every Christmas morning, people leave flowers, 7 white roses for the victims, and their dreams that were never realized. The community holds a vigil, not just to remember the dead, but to remind the living that domestic violence doesn't always look like what we expect, and that sometimes the most dangerous moment is when someone finally finds the courage to leave.